issue. Turns out it is an issue, and we've done a couple of pieces of research, very interesting. One that shows that foreclosures in America were more likely, came faster and harder on the outskirts of cities and metro areas than in the core because of that drive to qualify got out of balance. The other thing we found is that people are now, not urban planners and not designers and not architects, people buying houses are now willing to pay more for houses with high walk scores. In other words, houses that are closer to more destinations, multiple destinations, than homes with low or average walk scores. Now that's a big deal in terms of what's happening in trend-wise. And it's interesting, I think probably the higher prices people are willing to pay for homes with high walk scores in part is also a reflection of our desire now for convenience. We're time-starved, we need convenience. That's one of the things that walk score reflects. That's one of the things that living compactly in denser places with mixed use reflects. We're also seeing nascent signs of shifts in values in the U.S., and I'll just talk quickly about four. The car is becoming less relevant. Now, I can tell you this is absolutely, after a 60-year inexorable rise in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, what's happened in the U.S. is that VMT has declined. And this is a real shocker that no one really predicted. Also turns out that kids are delaying getting their driver's licenses at ages 16, 17, 18. Again, in a dramatically surprising, the declines have been dramatically surprising. And not just new drivers who are driving less, again, the VMT is falling. And just as interest in cars is declining, interest in cycling is going up. I know you're trying to make provisions for cycling as well and increase it. It's interesting, if any of you have been to New York lately, you'll see an amazing increase, 28% in the last year, just in 1 year, of cyclists. 236,000 New Yorkers riding bikes every day, 51,000 New Yorkers started riding bikes last year, which I think is amazing. 1 out of every 24 vehicles in motion on New York streets is a bike. New Yorkers travel 1.8 million miles by bike every day, and it's the fastest growing mode of transportation in New York. Also, look at the interest in local food. Farmers markets in the U.S. increased 16% in 1 year, last year. Quite amazing. And if you think about that, it takes a lot of customers locally to support what farmers markets offer, because they're offering specialty foods, delicacies, and so people, it's frankly seems odd, but it's an urban trend. And by the way, the more compact places we make, the more farmland there is, right? So we're not just eating up farmland for no good reason. So something's happening here. Less driving, more cycling, more local food. Those are all trends that are emerging in cities that we just would not have predicted a few years ago. And as they grow, I think they only make cities more appealing. And let me tell you about one more trend that we've identified in cities that actually is present in every single one of the top 51 metro markets in America. In 1980, people 25 to 34 years old were 10% more likely than other Americans to live within a 3-mile radius of the CBD, or the CAD. By 1990, that had increased to 12%, not a big jump, but a jump. By 2000, they were 33% more likely than other Americans to live within that, in close-in neighborhoods. Now that is astonishing if you think about it, and again, that trend is present in every one of the top 51 metro markets. So so this is what young people are doing, and I think you can look ahead and say if that's a lifestyle they're choosing in great numbers and in much greater numbers than the rest of the population, that's something we need to pay attention to. In other words, it's all about the market. This is not something you have to force onto people. the market is changing and the market is responding to these kinds of trends. Further, thanks to some new research done by the Knight Foundation, or funded by the Knight Foundation and done by Gallup, we now know that there are three primary factors that are driving attachment to community. They are openness, which you have in spades, social offerings, and aesthetics. Aesthetics, placemaking. Those are the three factors driving attachment. And if you think about that, you know, you say, okay, so how do we do the job of growing this place and growing this place in sensible ways? You don't have to make a trade-off. In fact, you better not make a trade-off between aesthetics and placemaking and growth, right? So don't try to make that trade-off. You just end up in the wrong place. And then finally, just a couple of other trends I want to mention. One is technology, and we all know that that technology is in a lot of ways changing our relationship to community. I think, you know, the predictions were that, you know, the death of distance and we won't need places will become irrelevant, we'll all connect on the web, and we all know that that's exactly the opposite of what happened. Actually, technology is driving us to meet face-to-face, to meet more people face-to-face. Technology makes commuting a lot better. Texting while driving is very dangerous and increasingly illegal. But you can do it on the train when someone else is driving. And increasingly, when people do want to drive, you know, they say, let me share a car. Zipcar in the US, that phenomenon exists everywhere. In fact, we're doing a whole lot more sharing of everything, vacuum cleaners, purses, you name it. So suffused with technology, compact cities are the key to what some people are calling now the post-ownership society, sort of a whole way to lighten up and not be so dependent on our own resources, our own capital, but to be able to share that with others. And it's really interesting. We're also seeing in the U.S. a whole group of local officials who are now saying, how do we use technology to enable citizens to do things for themselves that we are no longer going to be able to do, at least not in the short term, because of our budget crunch. And so we're seeing all the factors pointing to the growing appeal of city living, new, improved, enabled, even driven by technology. And then there's one more trend I want to talk about, which I think is the most important of all. And I mentioned it yesterday in the visit with the staff at Vic Urban. The demography and the geography of the economy is growing much lumpier, and it's doing it every day. Richard Florida talked about spiky cities. If you look at what's happening in the U.S., even as late as August of this year, those with four-year degrees in the U.S. had an unemployment rate of 4.6%. Those with some college, so we're not talking about high school dropouts or those with just a high school degree, some college had an 8.7% unemployment rate, almost double. With a college degree in America, your average annual earnings are $59,280. With some college, you average $21,000 less. In other words, your economic status is very much, you like it or not, fair or not, your economic status is actually driven by your education status. And that's the story for individuals. But then if you look at what's happening with cities, if you take that same information and try to shoot it through a city lens, here's what happens. 58% of any city's success, if you measure success as, or if you define success as per capita income, 58% of any city's success is foretold by the percentage of college graduates in its population. Now, when 60% of your success, when anything explains 60% of your success, you need to pay attention. And now if you layer that on with where talent is choosing to locate, it gets really scary in the US, because what's happening is that talent is collecting in fewer and fewer places. In other words, talent wants to be with talent because talent makes talent more valuable. And this is it's a real conundrum. It's a serious issue. And so what's happening is, in my work at CEOs for Cities, a lot of urban leaders will say to me, what do we do, right? I mean, because only 16 of the top 51 metro areas actually gained 25 to 34-year-olds in the decade between 1990 and 2000. So what, if we're not in the 16, if we're not in the elite 16, what do we do? And what I tell cities is this. There are two things, I mean, there are a lot of things that matter to the success of cities, but there are two things you need to pay attention to. You need to pay attention to talent, and you need to pay attention to quality of place. Because developing talent's the most expensive job you'll ever do in a city, right? Education, very expensive. You need to do it, you ought to do it. But you don't want to do it and then not be able to hang on to people. So part of the issue, and the way I think you hang on to people is you provide quality of opportunity and quality of place. Now, if you think back on those factors that I told you were coming out of the Knight Foundation, the Gallup work, Soul of the Community, you think about those three factors. Openness, well, that's all about quality of opportunity. Social offerings, well, they flow naturally from quality of place that puts people together in compact, vibrant settings and are supported with a great public realm that acts as a magnet for people and art and culture of the kind you've invested in here. And aesthetics, that's all about place. So as much as I believe that talent, and our research shows that talent is the primary driver of city success, I believe that quality of place is a deep driver of talent and where it settles. You can't separate the two. Talent and quality of place go hand in hand. So making great places is not something you do after you've done everything else. It's not something you do only when budget times are good. In fact, I would actually flip that notion and assert that if budget times are going to be good, you have to invest in quality places. At CEOs for Cities, we're working really hard to bring this proposition to priority of urban leaders, and we're challenging them to do more than make an iconic place or a single light rail line or a transit-oriented development or one great park or some green buildings. All of those can be worthy projects. You need to do them. But we ought to have bigger ambitions for the places we make. I think we have to relearn that context matters. I'm always surprised that, by cities that won't make the tough decision to contain sprawl, but believe that some green buildings will be a game changer. Or by cities that employ the star architect to design the iconic museum or performing arts center, as great as it may be, that won't invest in the arts and culture that go inside the building. Or by cities that invest in so-called green neighborhoods without considering how people will get to them or, in our experience yesterday, get out of them. I'll tell you a story. In the U.S. Last week, we celebrated the world's first certified living buildings. And as a first quick cut, we checked the walk score for each of these buildings. The first was in Rhinebeck, New York. It had a walk score of 11 out of 100. 88% of the U.S. population lives in places with a higher walk score. The second was in Tyson, Missouri. It was located in a forest reserve. It's about 2 miles from anything. Its walk score, 0. The third is called EcoSense. Don't you love that name? Near Victoria, British Columbia. Its walk score is all of 2 out of 100. So you add together these 3 so-called living buildings, and they have a combined walk score of 13. Now, just for comparison, my own home in downtown Chicago, which is not labeled a living building or a green building, has a walk score of 95. I live in Walker's Paradise. My home in downtown Memphis has a walk score of 89. So you wonder, which is a living building? I mean, it's hard to be the epitome of green if no one can get there without a car. I mean, how sustainable can they be? Context matters.